If you work in a topical research field which has lots of potential applications out in the real world, and you have built up to a reasonable public profile, you will inevitably get a significant number of regular requests to chat about how what you know or what you can do or what your team can do might be able to solve some problems for a potential industry, government, or even startup partner. This is, in fact, from my perspective, one of the great pleasures of being in academia, the ability to occasionally use your skill set or your experience that you've worked so hard to develop to perhaps try and help someone with a real world problem or issue or opportunity that they have. Early on in your career, it's very exciting and you might do just about anything possible to try and land that first one or two projects with industry or government working on a more applied problem. But as you move on in your career and become more senior, generally speaking, you would try and become a little bit more discerning with your project choices and what you actually might commit to, both in terms of your own workload and capacity, but also in terms of delivering the best possible outcome for your potential partner. When a partner comes and talks to you, the aim really should not be to guarantee that you end up walking out of the room with a project, because in most cases, that's not going to be an optimal outcome for either yourself or for the partner. There are a few typical outcomes. First, the rare but much desired one where the problem set that they've come to you with is a perfect match for your experience and also your current capacity, and you do indeed do a project together. That is going to be in the minority of situations. The second situation is that they've clearly identified a problem. It's possibly somewhat technically related to what you can do, but you're not anywhere near the best fit for it. And in those cases, you try to work with them to refer a colleague or someone else you know who does have that capacity and would be a better fit for that project. A third potential outcome is simply that it's very clear that there's a total mismatch between what they're interested in doing and what you or any of your colleagues could bring to the table, in which case it's an interesting conversation. And you've got to remember that even though this problem hasn't worked out, they may come back in future and with an interesting problem that is more aligned with what you want to do. And finally, often what comes out of these discussions, especially with relatively inexperienced people in the room, is that in talking through the problem set, they'll come to a very different realization about what they want or don't want to do. And often it will require going back to the drawing board and thinking about it quite a bit more. One of the traps that these initial meetings can fall into is diving straight into the so-called weeds of the problem and nutting out very detailed technical possible solutions without really considering the context, the general context around finances, the nature of the problem, and a bunch of other factors is so incredibly critical. I would argue that it is often more critical than the details of the specific problem. Obviously, they are important as well, but if you don't understand, and when I say don't understand, I mean everyone in the room, the key critical pieces of context, then the discussion is often going to bog down in details and not actually be that productive. So, what are some framing questions that you can ask or bring up that can help define the context, refine the scope of what we're talking about in one of these meetings? The first one is the simple, why are we sitting here? Why is this a problem or potential problem that we're talking about? Why is it not a mature and solved problem that we don't even think about anymore? And this will reveal, first of all, a bit more about the nature of the problem. It will reveal whether the people you're talking to have done their research and looked at what solutions there are and determined that they are insufficient, or whether they still need to do that search. It'll establish, I guess, the maturity of thought about the problem. Whenever you're sitting in a room discussing a potential problem and maybe some research-related solutions to it, some awareness and, I guess, humility that this conversation has quite possibly happened hundreds or thousands of times in other similar rooms all around the world. Not always, sometimes there is genuinely a niche application, but often it is something that has at least been thought about and potentially addressed elsewhere. So what's the precedent? What do we know about other people who have this problem? How have they gone about solving it, or have they just given up and it's still a problem to be solved? And if so, why did they give up? Why did they determine that it was not worth pursuing? There's a very important concept that I like to get to very early in these meetings, which is to define what category of problem it is. So one type of problem is a problem that essentially boils down to resources and efficiency. So one way to get at this is to basically propose the question of, if your operational budget was 5 times as large as it is now, and you had to spend it on this problem, so you couldn't use it to save money elsewhere, would that basically solve most of your problems overnight? Not particularly attractive because you're spending a lot more money, but is that the nature of the problem? Does more money pretty simply lead to a fairly good solution? More money does not always equal a simple solution to the problem, however. So there are a class of problems where even if hypothetically there was to be more resources and funding, that isn't going to solve the fundamental problem. So it's a problem where perhaps they need a new technical innovation, and that can't be compensated for by just throwing more money at more workers. There's a range of problems or a class of problems where genuinely there is some sort of innovation required in order to make progress. When you potentially address a problem, one of the other important pieces of context is this a widely and regularly repeating problem, or is this a once-off problem that if you are able to solve it, will never be touched upon ever again and will not come up in any other circumstances? The reason why this is such an important question to get to is it affects the likely scale of resources that you can throw at the problem, and it also affects how many other people are potentially interested in solving this problem. Why is that important? If you're in an area like robotics or tech, it affects the likelihood that there are software packages, algorithms, sensors, hardware, and so forth that you can buy off the shelf that are likely to be highly relevant for the problem. It also affects the level of potential commercial interest in solving this problem. And again, solving a problem entirely from a research environment is not always realistic. You'd often want to partner with, for example, a provider of sensor technology or compute technology. But their willingness to partner with you is going to partly depend on both the scale of the problem, but also the regularity of this problem. Is this an ongoing market opportunity? Who cares and who pays is also another important question or topic to discuss. So there are problems that are widespread problems that cost systems billions of dollars, but which the individuals or even the individual organizations or businesses within that ecosystem are not directly interested in funding solutions for. Perhaps there's an expectation that this is something that government should do. The reason this is so important is it again affects the way in which resourcing could be raised to solve the problem. If it's a problem that government is just expected to take care of, then there's going to be greater good and responsibility for the citizens and for the country considerations. If it's something where individual interests identify this as a direct financial opportunity or cost, it's going to be much easier to raise money directly from them because they are keen to throw money at a solution. And again, this affects the nature of the types of solutions and the people you'd bring on board or the organizations you'd collaborate with in order to potentially go about solving the problem. Another way I try and get at the context of the problem and what is known is by posing this question, which is simply, why is your sector or field not drowning with obnoxious startups who are clamoring to solve your problem for you? This isn't always a relevant question, but often it really gets at the heart of, is this a well-known problem? If you develop a solution to this problem, is it an accessible market or is it locked behind closed doors? Is it a very locked off industry that any random startup can't really access? Or is it an industry where that startup would find it hard to directly monetize a solution, even if that solution is wonderful for the problem set? Even if the topic is looking promising, it's an interesting problem, it's a problem that aligns pretty uniquely and well with the skill set or the skill set of the team you would bring to bear. One of the things to think about is, even if you were able to develop a solution, how is your industry or government partner actually going to leverage that solution? So typically they will need some sort of commercial grade solution that has a lot of the checks and balances built into it. And universities alone are not always fantastic at doing that. They can do it, but it's not necessarily the core to what they do. Is there a spin-off or a startup? Is it a technology licensing play? Do you need a third party or an OEM in order to fully deliver the potential product or solution in a way that your industry or government partner can actually make use of it? Obviously, there are exceptions. If it's more of an ad hoc project, sort of taped together solutions are sometimes appropriate for smaller projects as long as everyone knows what they're in for. But often you'll need that sort of commercial slick productization, and that's where these other considerations and thinking ahead a little bit are really important. a lot of large organizations that you work with will not be able to, for example, hold intellectual property. They will not have internal technical teams to further refine and mature the technology. And so you'd have to find other ways to do that for them. Another key question around context is financials. And so this might be a government partner or an industry partner who has a current inadequate but good enough for now solution to the problem. One of the things that's really useful is to ask them, if they're willing to share, how much they currently spend on a per annum basis to solve this problem, and whether they're willing to keep spending the same amount or they want to halve that bill. That will help identify whether this is primarily an efficiency play where you're trying to develop a solution that basically does what their current solution does, but for half the resourcing cost, whether that's labor or cost or energy consumption or consumption of consumables, or whether it's something where they're willing to spend the same amount of money but want to get a better outcome, better detection, better accuracy, some other improvement in how they do things. The amount of money that they're currently throwing at the problem on a per annual basis also gives you a rough idea of the magnitude of what solutions are in play. So an organization that spends $100,000 per year to address a problem, the class of solutions and what is feasible to go about attacking that problem is going to be vastly different to something where there's $100 million spent per year on the problem. And having a rough idea of this magnitude will help you shape feasible solutions to their problems in the discussion. And finally, when this industry partner or government partner comes to you and describes the problems, one of the things is to check and double check their assumptions that they're walking into the meeting. So they may have a little bit of knowledge about the potential solution set that you would bring to the problem. Some of that understanding may be spot on, but they may also, and this happens all of the time, be laboring under false or misconceptions about what technology can and can't do. And so when they're going through what they've already thought about in terms of how to solve the solution, it's good to very gently check their understanding of why they've made a statement or why they've gone down a certain line of thinking, just to check whether that's being made on valid and current assumptions, especially in technological areas where some of the tech is changing very quickly. And so an option they may have just ruled out 3 years ago is now much more feasible because of technology advancements. There will be some situations where context is too constraining and you want everyone in the meeting to go in with no preconceptions and no limits to their thinking. But for the vast majority of these problem-focused meetings and early stage discussions with a potential industry or government partner, getting a mutual and crisp and correct understanding of all these critical pieces of context, what has already been done to solve the problem, why is there not already a solution to the problem, what are the financial factors and so forth, is so incredibly important to correctly shaping the discussion and maximizing the chances that that will be productive, whether or not it results in them working with you or a colleague or going back to the drawing board and refining their understanding of what they really need.